We are live, everybody. Welcome to another weekly technical discussions call for the Rapid Diffs effort. With that in mind, I'll go to the agenda. I added an item here that comes from the discussion we just had on the coordination call with the PMs. And they're very pleased with the progress. They thanked for the updates and everything. We have a lot of work in flight. But one of the things that we were just talking about was the performance metrics and acceptance criteria assessments. Essentially, it'd be nice to have the performance, like we have an issue scheduled for 17.1 that is to add basic accessibility tests to see the compliance level that we're having throughout the project. And one of the things we'll also want to do is to spend some time thinking about how we'll track the performance of the app and how we're assessing whether we're compliant with the targets or not. We have targets for the sizes of the JavaScript transfer, assessment for the sizes of the HTML transfer, but also the timing for that performance mark we have for the first diff shown. So how will we assess this? Is this something that is manually checked? Is it something that automated? So we probably want to have something added to 17.2. So we should take the time until then to kind of think how and to discuss how we think that should happen. And yeah, document that in an issue. Anybody has thoughts on that?
I think we should start at least with the time to first diff. Go with that. The main challenge here is that we shouldn't be checking this performance in our sort of regular JavaScript, because it starts way past when you see the actual diff file. So we should do that actually from the HTML. And we might use window object to pass the metrics from the diff to the front end.
So I want to clarify this one thing. I think in that discussion earlier, we had a bit of a confusion. There's several metrics that are similar. One is time to first byte, which is, the time that the browser starts receiving information. And then there's the time to first diff, which is a marking that we have devised on the front-end application. So what you're saying is we should track that, but not at the JavaScript level, move that to a different way to track it at the HTML level.
Yep, it should be moved to either a view component or to the page itself. So it should be living in a XAML file.
But how do you so that's the JavaScript API that we use to track that. You're saying don't use that, use something else?
No, I'm saying we'll probably need to call this directly as a plain script file, like script tag, and our code goes there. And I don't see a better way of doing it right now.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
That's how I did that exactly in my POCs.
No, I see what you mean because of the server-side rendered thing. That's the most accurate thing before, waiting for the JavaScript to bootstrap and everything.
Yep.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Yeah, that's the issue. It's like first track it, but also how we're gonna keep a record of it. So we talked about in the previous call that we could potentially recover the dashboards that were lost, that was testing production. So we could potentially specify which URLs to test. We could also leverage the 10K architecture because it's tracking this metric. So yeah, we can have a bunch of things done. We just need to set up a baseline and calculate that baseline so that then we can compare with the numbers we're getting on our app throughout the time.
So 10K architecture actually sets up a specific MR for each test run. So I would rather use get a copy of what we have with our current diffs and just enable rapid diffs and test against them. That way we can test our abstract numbers for these diffs and compare between rapid diffs and regular diffs. I know that it doesn't really reflect the production performance, right? but at least we get a baseline how it works in isolation.
You mean in the 10K tests?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so for me that's the conversation. Like we have to check with the team because I don't know how easy it is to convince them to add a test page to that report, let's say. So we should think about that. Thomas?
Just looking for some clarification on that discussion about like where do we start tracking performance? Because my understanding was that the base implementation of this will stream the HTML to a like small web component that renders the diffs, um, or it renders the streamed HTML as it comes in, which to my understanding, would require that we start some JavaScript for that to function. Um, is that not true?
So the current idea of how we should do things is that we render about 5 files on the page immediately with the document. So it goes with the rendered Rails output. Then we initialize our JavaScript and that fetches HTML stream and puts that on the page. So as soon as we start actually streaming the response from Rails, we have already initialized web components. And the delay between seeing a web component in your browser and actually it being interactive shouldn't be that big. That actually depends on how big are the div files and how much JavaScript you are actually putting on the page.
That is something that we still like. That's a theory, right? One of the things we want to try, and we have an issue for that in 17.1, is to give that a try and we want to see what is the difference, right, in terms of timing and all that. Because there's definitely a sweet spot there. I think Patrick in the past raised the question that maybe, or it was you, Thomas, I can't remember, that maybe we can go straight to streaming and maybe that's even faster. So we don't
That's
really.
that's actually a different one. So I think what Thomas is suggesting is that when we see a web component on a page, like we expect it to be interactive, and if we haven't started our JavaScript, you can't do anything with it, right? You see a div file, but it's not interactive. And that is a good concern.
Yeah.
So the goal is to initialize web components as soon as possible. But I think that will happen in the same place as we initialize our main entry point and page entry points.
Yeah, that's what I expected. I guess to say the part out loud that I didn't say. As a user, I don't care at all that there's HTML on the page. I care that it's interactive. And so numbers that show me how quickly I can see something are very close to meaningless to me as a user. It's good that stuff is visible, but if I can't, add a comment or something, then it's essentially useless. So that's what I was getting at. I was like, if it's not interactive, then it doesn't matter how fast it got there.
So that is a very important distinction, and I welcome you brought that up because one of the goals of the project is perceived performance, right? And that is a very qualitative metric, I guess. I mean, we can add some quantitative metrics to see if we can like infer it a little bit. But you're right. Like if I'm pushing a button and it doesn't interact with it, perceived performance sucks, right? However, if the time to first byte and interactive is only a couple of milliseconds, that would be the goal, right? They immediately see it right away. And as we're bootstrapping JavaScript, they already see it. By the time that they aim the cursor to click on it, it's already interactive. So I think what this means is we should track both the time to first diff so that it shows on the page immediately with a script tag. We track that time, but we should also track the time that we bootstrap the first interactive component on the whole page. That's another mark. Because I think those two moments, if they're too far apart, they also tell a story that we need to track. So I think that's a fair point.
I also add is that like it's on us to make this feel responsive and quick. So we should strive to do stuff that is important to user, and everything that is not important at the moment, do that in the background or later. Like you don't want to initialize every single web component on the page with all the functions that it can do, right? You want to work on visible files. You want to render discussions so that you can search for them, but you don't have to do this for every single feature on the div file. And that's where we start to do optimizations.
Okay, so we wanted to move all these thoughts to that issue to be created for 17.2 so that we can like sketch out exactly what needs to be added to that initial pass. And again, what we want from this initial pass is not to have a realistic final number. It's just to keep us on our toes as we're developing features. And we'll be able to see the delta. That's what Kai was saying earlier on the call, was that it'll be interesting to have that along the life cycle of the project, so we can keep track of how things are evolving as we're adding stuff.
That's why I like 10K architecture. I think they have some kind of a dashboard with all the results. So we can actually track time to first div throughout the development process.
I don't disagree. However, having that report be polluted with test pages, if they do it for us, they should be able to do that for other people too. So it will be immediately, the report will be a little bit harder to read and harder to parse. So we might ask them to set up a separate test environment. So this is probably something to chat about with our SCT counterpart, see what they think, and see what we can come up with.
Sure.
Right. So for now, I think that's a good. We'll just make this into an issue, and we'll go from there. Thomas, so voice it.
Yeah. We have our metrics about how much is delivered across the wire and how many bytes are going to be parsed and all kinds of stuff. All that stuff is basically, well, other than the HTML delivered by the backend, it's all basically JavaScript and CSS. And right now, like when I did that proof of concept to demonstrate the event system, it was like 5 files of, I don't know, 10K each or something. It was like, it wasn't that much code. But the page still loaded like 4 megabytes of JavaScript because it's just in the context of GitLab. And I would like to be able to take the output from the backend of this new system, so like some diffs basically, and load a script tag in isolation from GitLab and say, okay, this is how much our application loads, this is how much the backend loads, and that's like a pure number without loading any of the other stuff. We're gonna have that would necessarily skip all of our view components basically, because that's pretty much what all the other weight is. But I think we should get there sometime soon. Andreas, you're replying, because it's really hard to tell like when a change adds a megabyte or a kilobyte, because it's lost in this huge payload on the page. So
Yes, I think that's important because it's also part of our acceptance criteria that we have in the blueprint. I do think it's useful and it's worthwhile, and of course, it's part of our acceptance criteria for a reason, not just from that perspective of being able to measure things in isolation, but also to ensure we're not making the code dependent on anything part of the page. I think it gets trickier because right now, the way we're handling this thing, the streaming endpoint that streams the server-side rendered content will be developed, will need to be added per page where it's used. So it's not just plug and play. We have to have some requirements for those pages. But I think this opens up a conversation about exactly that point. What happens when we don't? So what happens if I want to reuse this, but I'm not a GitLab page? Like, can I leverage this app? And I think that will increase the robustness of the code. I mean, potentially might mean that we need a generic. So, for example, when we develop the commit streaming endpoint, we might do that in a way that it's fairly generic. Or I don't know, just develop a generic streaming endpoint that takes as parameter what context or what type of mode diff you want. Is it persisted? Is it not persisted on the database? So I feel like that's more of a backend optimization that we're gonna have to do. This conversation will force that. Stanislav.
I might misunderstood this, but do you mean like setting a dedicated page without any layout with just the T files?
I mean, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
We will do that. We actually,
yeah.
it's part of the accessibility testing. So accessibility
Okay.
testing will use standalone div file, and we can create a page that renders like 50 div files on a page.
Yeah.
And we can actually measure the performance of that page disregarding the slowness of the rest of the system, right?
Yeah. Hopefully, as long as it's just an HTML file, basically.
Yeah, something very simple, bare bones with no other layout parts of
Yeah.
yeah.
Because a lot of like even when I in that POC where I just wiped out all of the MRs basically and just put in my own code, I didn't intentionally load anything, but it was loading all kinds of stuff. I mean, obviously the layout was a lot of it, super sidebar and all kinds of stuff, but it was also loading a bunch of like other scripts that were loading on the page that were just injected because it was part of the routing. I don't know how we can get around that to see our stuff in isolation. I assume you can turn that stuff off. I just don't really know enough about Rails to do it.
We can
So
create a
Paulina,
separate issue just for that, like what you mentioned, to have a dedicated page just for isolated performance testing when we give a specific set of div files data to our view components, just render things and see how slow it renders. I don't think it will be very slow because it's a view components and they precompile usually. But we can also add JavaScript to that page only for the div files
Yeah,
and sort of
that'd be good.
hack our ways around so it works.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that'd be
we
good.
can do that.
Sorry, I missed the very, very beginning of what you said, Stanislav. Did you want me to create an issue for that, or do we have an issue for that?
I don't think we have an issue for that. We only have the one for accessibility testing, and that kind of assumes we will have the page with just the div file.
Okay.
So you might want to create one for performance
Yeah.
testing as well.
Yeah, I can do that.
yeah, and keep an eye out for the work that Paulina will be doing with the accessibility testing. Could be fun. And if we can tailor that for what we need, could be useful. Sorry. Right. Anything else at this point for that? Then if no other issues, we can move on to the front-end architecture discussion. Sounds good? So I wanted to open a discussion on the demo we saw last time from Thomas. Thank you for the recording. It was nice watching that after I dropped. And I have a few things to share. There was definitely so one of the things I wanted to say here is the challenge ahead of us now, right? Because when we're developing something new and with new principles and following like easier to use concepts and better developer experience and all that stuff, we have to keep a couple of things in mind. One is the uh, applicability to the problem at hand. That's one. But the other is we're not developing this project completely inside of a bubble. We're still inside GitLab. We still want code base to be able to be reviewed by other people. So that is something that we need to be mindful. It doesn't mean that we can't do things a little different here and there that we're talking about doing like web components and glue. So there's already some exceptions there. So we totally can introduce some things. But we have to be mindful about those things. Something that you and I, like me and Thomas talked about on the one-on-one is like, if we have something that is very similar to something we already have, we need to potentially compromise and find a way to shoehorn what we're thinking into something that is already in the code base rather than trying to ship another tool to do a very similar job of what already exists. I was talking about the event bus at the time. It's a little different, but that is just an example of the challenges ahead of us. So that's one. The other thing is we won't be able to accommodate everything all at once. For example, the demo had parts where it leveraged IndexedDB to kind of like leverage the data store there on the browser and everything. As a long-term thing, I believe that diffs themselves will at some point leverage IndexedDB. I don't think it's reasonable to expect that that will happen on the first version. And I think Thomas and Stanislav and Phil, I think we all agree with that. We know that it's a nice thing to know that it's possible, but it might not be that the first day. What else do I wanted to say? My nose is clogging up like nothing else. I think you can hear it. There was one thing I wanted to add more. So yeah, so the I think the ultimate challenge right now is to see out of this demo, what is the parts that make sense to apply to this project and like cherry pick that and pull this into our plan and try to set up an implementation plan for that to go ahead. Because there's definitely parts in this proposal that are making it easier for us to do certain things. There are parts that we need to identify exactly what they are to see that where they're good ideas, but in our project would cause some entropy for other people and for us ourselves to work with it. So I don't mean that we'll sacrifice our principles and try to do something bad just so others can review it. That's not what I'm saying. But it's important to understand we won't be able to just like do whatever we want and then ship it and then be done with it. So with that being said, I did want to say that one of the things I loved about this demo was how the way that Thomas, you organized the code, it was pretty separate in terms of like what does what. It takes a little bit of learning to understand exactly who's responsible for what, and that's the part that we need to probably do a little bit clear, make it a little bit clearer for everybody. And yeah, so that was a separation that I really enjoyed seeing. But I don't want to like take the whole I don't want to like take it apart from the top to finish myself, but I wanted to open a discussion with those points. So I wanted to like open the floor to kind of questions that people might have to expand and maybe make clarify certain parts of the demo, so that we can then move on to as I by the way, I don't have any expectation they'll have an outcome today on what the plan is to implement. It's going to take a couple of passes until we like fully established on a set course, but it would be nice to start having a bit of clarity on the things that didn't get covered on the demo. So maybe we start there. Stanislav?
Yes, at first I'd like to mention stuff I really liked. The first thing is separation of concerns, that we kind of structure our code in meaningful parts that are easier to reason about, and contracts in between these parts. So we have clear contract with what data exactly we are expecting and what data we are producing. But I have two major issues, I would say, with this approach. So I'll try to voice them. So the first one is that it's a
You
mental
voice,
shift.
I type.
Okay. So the first one is a mental shift in how we work with code, right? At this point, we are kind of state focused. So we think of our UI as a function of a state. We have some state. If that state changes, we produce new UI. But with this approach, it changes from state-based to event-based or action-based. And that gives us another problem. Since we have most of our UI written in Vue, it kind of goes sideways from what we have right now in Vue components. And I was wondering how we're going to address it, like how this approach will work with existing Vue code base, because it doesn't expect you to react to actions, it expects you to change data. And that's my primary concern with Vue integration.
That's a good point to start, which is something we talked about. We won't be able to we won't be able to rewrite the entire app. So there's probably going to be bits at the edges of the component tree that will definitely be handled by Vue. How we reconcile those two things?
Yeah, so there's no getting around the fact that parts of our application will have to rely on a Vuex store from what I understand, without fully rewriting them. So for example, I think the comment box, maybe not actually. I'm trying to think of like which pieces do depend on data changing. Because some things have connections out to a Vuex store where data changes, and I mean the secret is it's not really depending on data changes, it's depending on a function call, because that's being brought in as a mix-in basically into the Vue component. When data changes, it updates a data property on the component, which is then internally reactive. And we could do that. We could set a property reactively. But the point is, I'm not sure which pieces require a Vuex store, but we will have to update them. I mean, we're not going to rewrite major Vuex stores like the Node store, for example, I assume. But the idea is that by using the event hub or the event bus as the central conduit, those Vuex updates don't have to be part of our application. They can be a piece of logic attached to an event occurring. So some event occurs, like the user has opened the comment box or whatever, and then it goes in and it triggers an action into a Vuex store, which then updates the Vue components that are not part of this system. The ideal world is that all UI components are like property driven. So it doesn't require a tight coupling of like the storage mechanism to the UI. It just requires that the component is provided new properties, which would be trivial is the wrong word, but it would be trivial to pass in data or update properties internally with a subscription. But that's a long way in the future. So, I mean, right now it would just be Vuex is updated in logic, because that is one of our storage mechanisms. To me, it's not the ideal storage mechanism, it's elsewhere, but one of our storage mechanisms is over in logic. And so in that graph or that chart that I made in the proposal, I expanded data to say like, it was like API specific utilities just to like manipulate data, and browser storage or something like that. I think that was the three things. And Vuex is essentially part of browser storage because it puts it in memory, I guess. It's not anywhere else. It's in memory. So that's one of the storage options that is abstracted away behind the logic.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Or does that?
So let's say we write a new component that doesn't have to rely on Vuex. How would you integrate this view component with this architecture, with data access layer.
Yeah, so I would say that. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, let me just ask you this. When you say writing a new component, is that a new view component
Yes,
or
a view
generic?
component.
Okay,
No,
view
a
component.
new view component.
So the new view component is well, that's an interesting question. Why are we writing a new view component? That's the first question. Okay, but let's say we are.
No, wait, I think that's important conversation. I think it's important to address that because I feel like
I think
need to
we are
align
not
there.
like teaching Vue at all because we have most of the stuff written in Vue, and also we have GitLab UI, right? So we'd like to reuse all the pajamas UIs that we already have in the code base. And I expect we'll be writing most of the UI in Vue. And that's the stuff that people are familiar with.
That's what I was asking. Important to have that conversation now because the way that I've been thinking about this throughout this time is that we have this glue between the backend server-side rendered and the dynamic parts, the web components, the low-level operations, whatever. But all the dynamicism that comes onto the diffs, part of me was thinking that what would make sense is to leverage, the knowledge of the team in writing things in Vue, because when we go and start talking about rendering things with, if it's like say the viewed toggle, which is a very simple component, I think it's a good example. We could get by with just a simple web component for that easily, right? However, we would have to re-implement the looks of the checkboxes on GitLab UI. We'd have to do a bunch of, or just re-import that into the web component. We have to find a way to do template languages, to have a language for templating. We have to do all that. And that's the thing that I was talking about in the beginning, where if we shift too much away from what people are used to, imagine somebody from, Verify coming over and review just a simple tweak to the way that the viewed checkbox works, they wouldn't be able to understand the code base that we're working on. And I think to me as a manager, that's a liability on the project from the perspective of, speed of reviews. That's one, because we want to get this fast into the code base. So we introduce some entropy there, but also, overall compatibility with other people coming from other teams to work on this. So I think that's an important aspect, even if it's not the ideal world that, we all know would be far better if you just an isolated app. Not better, but just less restrictions, I'd say. So that's why to me it's an important conversation to have whether we're aligned in this sense, where the dynamic parts, here's the thing. Vue doesn't mean Vuex. Vue doesn't mean Apollo. Vue is just that. That to me was fairly I don't want to say decided, but formalized in my mind that the dynamic parts that would step into the diff would be written in Vue. So I want to hear your side, Thomas, your perspective there.
Yeah, that all makes sense. It's so there are two downsides to defaulting to Vue. One is that it's going to be a lot harder to meet the performance budgets because Vue is about 3 times larger than other tools that do the same thing. 40K gzipped. It's delivered 112 minified bytes, which 112 kilobytes, which is that will also make it harder to hit performance budgets just like on compiling, right? Like the browser has to read all that, parse it, render, like run the code. So 112K to be run in the browser. The second piece is that we're going to hit there's a ceiling of how quickly we can do things with Vue. And by quickly, I mean like how can it render DOM, for example? Because it's fundamentally a VDOM tool, it is duplicating browser behaviors in JavaScript userland code.
Let me just remind you, Thomas, that the meaty-gritty content principle thing is already server-side rendered. So we're talking about like Chrome UI, interaction buttons, drop downs. So these are like the eye candy that we're adding on top of the main event. There's one point that I think you're right, where discussions, like how are we going to handle that in a very performant way? But going back to your initial point, I don't think we're going to be rewriting nodes anytime soon. So we'd have to find a way to at least use, I guess the way I'm thinking is using using web components as a vehicle to dump the notes app and the notes in place for sure. But I don't think we'll. So that's what I mean by that is like we're talking about we're gonna have to load Vue anyway, right? So that's part of the app. We're gonna have to pay that price sometime. We're not gonna pay that before we show the diffs. We're gonna pay that after we show the diffs, or we can pay that after we show the diffs if you want. So I'm thinking that while where you are right, it is something that has been accommodated or mitigated by how we set up the project steps, where we prioritize the static content as the main thing, and then we add the sugar on top, which might take a little longer. A second would fairly be too much, but still within the realms of acceptance for a button to show up for me to interact with it. Yeah, that's what I wanted to say.
I would also say, and I'm not sure. So this can we could be really nuanced with what Vue is touching, but you said that most of the heavy load is going to be delivered by the backend. But I could be wrong here, but if we use Vue DOM, if we're not just using Vue, the like reactive component library, if we're rendering things with it, it will take control. It will, once we attach it to something, it is then rendering that thing. And so for state changes, for example, it will need to represent that DOM internally and then re-render its update. And I
think
could
you're
be
right.
wrong on how it's
In that context, yeah.
Yes. So what I'm saying is we're not really preventing the performance issues. We're just deferring them until Vue starts with like how much VDOM takes over, or
I
like
think you're
how much overhead.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, that is a fair critique to do. Like we're deferring the performance delay that we're having by using an established library with a bunch of overhead. I think that's correct and accurate. But it also comes into play the fact that we're not rendering this on the entire page, just on what's being viewed on the viewport. So there's a bunch of like strategic decisions that we've taken to make this lighter as possible for Vue to act in a way that it's not how the current Vue works with the with the MR diffs, right? So I think you're correct, but the strategic parts of the project makes it so that the impact is mitigated or at least lessened. And by the way, we're over time, so I don't want to be. If you have to drop, we can watch the recording later. So yeah, but carry on.
So I can answer the question directly then. So in a Vue component, it's going to need to be dynamic. So kind of in like the ideal world, it would just be data is provided to a component and it has no like internal logic at all. It just takes in properties and decides how to render them or display them or whatever. But that's not super realistic. So the answer would just be each component subscribes to events that it cares about. So that is the sort of power and flexibility of this like standardized event system, where if a component, let's say the simplest possible thing, whether you're logged in or not, it should disable a button. As soon as it receives, obviously we're not implementing a login system, but this is just a very simple example. Component just listens for user authenticated event, and when that happens, it enables the button. And when it hears the logout event, it disables the button. That's a very, very simple example, but like any component can listen to any event that they care about. And
Well, I think that's a really enticing proposition, because I think you're in the part of like providing the component with props and just letting the component render it. I don't think that's that far-fetched. In your other
someone has
example,
to be updating those props, right? Someone somewhere has to be updating.
right?
So
And that's the part where I think the second part, for example, when you're putting the component on the page, you know, we always trigger an authenticated event every time we put something on the page to make sure that all the components know that. So it's probably going to need some bootstrapping information, which comes in the form of props or from somewhere. So I think the bootstrapping of it always goes bootstrap your component to this state that comes from somewhere else.
Yeah.
Where that's somewhere else, I think it's important, which because on the demo that you talked about, that we showed, you had different sources of data, which is something that we talked about, and it's pretty powerful. The data could come from the DOM, the data could come from IndexedDB, the data could come from this, from that, which is a really great abstraction power. But, and this is the part that I also struggle a little bit with the demo, and I saw that you were discussing this after I left. Right now, we're able to visualize the state of the app, right? At some point with developer tools to take a look at the state of UX, which I'm not arguing for UX, just stay with me. It's just that, we're going to have a way to retrieve the data from somewhere. So for example, what I'm thinking is all those pieces of sources of data, like the IndexedDB, the DOM, everywhere can be used as a bootstrap to something that we keep in memory to represent whatever it is that we need to render this app. We just have to figure out what are those first, what is that representation, and how do we wire those back into the components in a sustainable way? Because I think all of those ideas are incredibly powerful. Abstracting where the data comes from through one single point, but then have that affect the app that's being rendered is incredibly powerful. And I like that. But then coming back to this component part, I think the props, might actually be relevant. The events might also be relevant for some things. So for example, if you have a component that needs to be aware of things that are happening across the page, a good way to make sure that, but they're separate view apps, they're separate completely from each other. Maybe that's a good way to just make sure that we keep things in sync. But once we have a joint representation of things, I do wonder if we can't get rid of some of the bad parts, but still have that joint representation somewhere that it's easy to work with, not UX for sure. I'm not sure if Pina is something that we could leverage to make that like simple, because we already talking about using Pina for something else, right? And I do wonder if that could be something that we could leverage as easy to manage, simple thing going forward. But I don't know if that's the case, so you need to correct me if I'm wrong, Stanislav. I don't know where I was going with that, but it was kind of like a yes and. I think it's both. I think it's like data provided by components and props, data provided to components by props, but also have some mechanism of events would be interesting to have. But the thing is, maybe those events are a good way to channel changes to whatever we use to render the components later. And then later on, say that, for example, we wanted to dump all the state back to IndexedDB, right? We could use DOM, we could use not DOM, we could use events if we need to trigger something like that, like a commit to IndexedDB kind of thing. Because then we can notify everybody, hey, we're about to commit to IndexedDB, make sure that you stay up to date. And then after that, we trigger another event to kind of store it. So I don't know. I'm rambling a little bit here. Stanislav?
So this gives us basically two options to work with, right? We create some kind of intermediate module that stores view instance, so instance of the view app inside of it, and subscribes and publishes events and then updates that instance. And the second way is to subscribe and publish events directly in the component. And my problem with that is the first approach is a similar issue we'll face soon, because we'll have root component which has all the props and all the events on top of it, and you basically have to maintain it, right? And that leads to issues like props drilling. That's why we have UX in some cases, because it's too deep to reach bottom of the component tree. With the second approach, the problem is that we'll have to always keep a copy of the state. Like if you subscribe to an event, not only you are like subscribing in the component code, you're also maintaining a copy of that state in the data property, and then you're creating watchers for this data property to publish events, and it makes this approach kind of very wordy. Like it's adding a little bit of overhead to each instance of the component. So like these two issues are pretty important for me, because these are the common struggles when we work with Vue components. It's prop drilling and very verbose handling of state as a component.
Why do you need a copy in the Vue component?
Well, if you subscribe to some action, you cannot tell a Vue component like render this thing or hide this thing, right? You have to update the state, and then it will react to the state by updating the UI. So it has to be reactive, and you have to update it in the callback.
So I would say we're talking about two different types of state, I think. You have to react to data changing, and then the component state updates. So you don't need a duplicate of the data in your component. You just need what state is the component in. Is it
the relevant piece?
Yeah, is it loading? Is it in the loading state, or is it in disabled state, or what's the state? And that's I briefly demonstrated the finite state machines in the demo of like you transition to this state, you transition to that state, and then it's just what data does it render? What small piece of data? So I don't think you don't need to duplicate the reactivity system in Vue necessarily, except for like, oh, the text to render has changed or whatever. That piece needs to update. But that's a UI concern anyway. So
the way I see it, like the subscription of the event would eventually what it would do, so the task that is performed when the subscription triggers would be to update some form of local state, at least for the component to interact, which could be a portion of the larger state, whatever is relevant for them. But in that way, you'd leverage the Vue reactivity to then do whatever you need to do.
That's exactly my point. And in order for that to work, you'll have to have two copies of the state, right? One state will live throughout the event propagation. Like you publish an event in this layer.
I think I understand what you're saying.
That state lives in the message. Then you copy that state to the component's local state, and it keeps being there. And sometimes you might face an issue like state desynchronization, because component might have updated the state, but you forgot to publish it back, or somehow it got published in the wrong place or whatever it is. It gets really hard to track down. Like we have these issues with Vue reactivity already, and if we add integration with data access layer on top of it, it will be even harder to track down which part of the reactivity broke. Is it Vue reactivity, or is it event bus system that should update other components, for example?
So in that part, you will go into troubleshooting, right? I'm just like being able to understand what's going on with the whole app itself. And I think one of the benefits of, again, using Vue, I guess, is that will give us limited visibility on the edges. But to the cloud, we would need to have some sort of way to track what's going on there. But I think it's a pro and con, I guess, of changing the approach. Like whenever you use something like more imperative, you know what you're triggering. When you use something like events-based, you don't know what you're triggering, and that's the point. But I understand that that's a challenge, where how do I keep track of things being triggered? How do I keep track of the things that failed to trigger? Well, that's a question.
We face that issue every time when we have uncontrolled components, as they're called. So these are components that do not receive any props from the parent. And usually what happens is that you define the state in that component, and suddenly you have the need to control it from the parent. You start adding props, and then you add watchers to react to that state. Then you add watchers to publish that state back to the parent. And sometimes it gets really weird. You're not certain which state is like the source of truth. And the same thing will also apply here, because you will have two places where that state is coming from. One state is in the component, another state in the data access layer. And we'll have to basically sync them up.
I mean, so I guess I have one comment which kind of addresses all of that. This works the same way that Vuex does. It's just more obvious. Like Vuex also duplicates state into a component because you have to link, you pull in state into the component into the into the props of that component. It's not in the data property,
That's
but
kind
it
of
is pulling
different,
state in.
because Vuex doesn't let you like directly change the state. If you try to do that, you'll get an
I would say we should never be able to directly update state either. It's all through events. So a component should never be desynced because it's never updating state. It just says, I need to update state. And that happens somewhere else.
So my point stays, like, you cannot import state from Vuex, change it in the component, and expect it to update in other places. And Vuex is kind of straightforward with that. You have to use mutations, actions in order to change the state. And that's pretty much it.
Okay, so let me add something here to the mix. We're running way over time, so I wanted to potentially get a stopping point here and try to identify what are the things that. So from what I understand here, the bigger question is Vue integrated with a system like this. What would it look like? So maybe for next week, what we can prepare. And that next week the call is in the morning, so Thomas won't be able to be there. Wait, what did we decide? No, we have a separate call in the afternoon. Never mind. I remembered. So for next week, we can have until then, we can have a collaboration throughout the week to see if we can come up with an adjustments to that POC that Thomas has to kind of like imbue a Vue component. It could be like the Vue check mark. I think that's a fairly simple component. Try to see how that would fit into that thing. And throughout the week, we can have more conversations through Slack and something just to identify the best way to handle these sort of situations. Because I think I hear a lot of great points on both sides, and I definitely one of the things that I'm hearing is I don't want to in one side, I don't want to restrict the way we build the data flow to conform to a way that have been causing trouble for us already. But on the other hand, we also need to support that in somehow. So it's kind of like finding the balance here will be interesting. Plan was to already demo the Vue checkbox. Great.
It's a complete flow from user interaction to data storage. So it goes all the way back. So
I did not read that. So I'll go and read that today. Okay, so I feel like that's a good step forward just to see how, and then from that moment on that POC thing, we can potentially iterate a little bit and try to identify other things to discuss. And progress was made, but is there anything else that you'd like to talk today, or can we move on to next week, seeing that?
I had a second point, which kind of challenges the whole approach.
Voice it so we can like keep it in our minds.
Yeah, we don't have time to discuss it, but my point was that this was called like data access layer, but it doesn't actually address the data problems that we have. And the problem was managing state of the application at a single moment. And we kind of have state in all of the places like Vuex, component local state, some parts in Vue observable, some parts in GraphQL. And I think the goal was to like find a solution that unifies all of that into a single module or like a layer. But I think with this approach, we are having like it offers us multiple ways already to handle states. So from this POC, I think we found at least two ways. The first way is IndexedDB, and the second way is using DOM as a state. And I think we have problems with both of these. So IndexedDB is kind of an overkill because each operation is asynchronous. You cannot immediately return the value. And with DOM state, it's just slow. So accessing DOM to get the state is really slow. And if our focus is performance, I think it doesn't really fit us. So that was my biggest second concern with this.
So I think that's why earlier when I was mentioning that all of those things are great inputs to bootstrap something, it then needs to move on to a something, and that's why we haven't figured out exactly what it looks like. So I don't think that we should discard the possibility of having IndexedDB and DOM as inputs, but I feel definitely it might be better for, performance reasons and maintainability reasons and observability reasons to have a way to work with that in a way that it's not DOM or IndexedDB, but that's probably a separate conversation. The question is what that looks like. Like, I think we have the idea of like having separate calls. So for example, using the proposal, like you separate messages to perform tasks. But potentially what we need to discuss is in addition to that plan of specify where will the tasks write data to in a unified way. And because that then makes it easier to render everything around it. I guess that's the missing part in this conversation is I like the separation, I like the messaging, I like all that. But I think at a simple, and I think, Thomas, if I'm not wrong, the idea there would be to use those events to get those informations. Like I need to have, is it viewed or is it logged in or whatever? You'd send a message to get that data back or something. Is that it?
Yeah, I mean that's in the name, right? The data access layer. It's going to be essentially impossible to solve data. There are improvements we could make, but we're going to have to use lots of different things, including things like Vuex. The point is to standardize access and centralize control of whatever the storage solutions are, and like decomplex them away from UI and other pieces of logic. So like our business logic is controlled by a task, our UI requests tasks, and inside deep in that system, a storage component may operate, for example, IndexedDB or Vuex or whatever. The point is that if Vuex isn't right or IndexedDB isn't right, you don't need to go and update the component. It doesn't need to change its API. All that stays the same. You just swap out under the hood. Where is this stored? Is this right? What's the reaction here? Because it's all asynchronous and because it's abstracted, that stuff can be updated independently of our UI or our business logic.
Yeah, and I think I'm seeing that vision from the perspective of like I don't really care where the data lives when I'm accessing it, whether it lives on an API, whether it lives on IndexedDB, whether it lives there. But that's for the initial bootstrapping of the app. From the life cycle of the app where you start using it and start operating it, that's the part where the data access layer still needs to provide an answer to that doesn't resort to going back to the primary source to update it always every time there's a change. Maybe I'm, trying to separate the two things, but I think that it is important to kind of find a way to make it easy for us to work with this. And I think that's what we need. I think we need a real world case of seeing the view checkbox thing built in such a way, and then highlight we can't do this way, maybe we can do it that way, and then add some improvements and iterations. Because like I said, that demo was a starting point of a conversation that is incredibly valuable, right? Now we need to evolve it to a place where we can absorb it into the project, right? There's a couple of things that we're going to be taking verbatim. Others we're going to have to massage them and make them a bit more in tune with the project. So that's what we're doing here. And I think that's a very valuable conversation, albeit a bit long. So next week, I think we have an hour. Let me just double check real quick. No, we also have 30 minutes. Maybe we should make it an hour. Maybe. I don't know. But we'll talk about it. Are we in a good place to stop and to postpone this to next week? At least coming out with this idea of like, let's try out with the viewed thing, with this thing in mind. Then we'll chat throughout the week about improving some of these things we're talking about.
Yeah, I think so.
Cool. And I understand this is sometimes it feels like we're pushing a big stone up a hill, but from the sides that I'm standing on, this is progress. So we're analyzing and we're making like we're shaving things off shaving the peels, so the layers off the onion, kind of trying to get to the core of it, so that by the time we get to stage one to build the features, all of this is behind us and we're just writing code to integrate with what we built. So thank you so much, everybody, for the patience and for the discussions and for putting things forward and for taking the time to go through this. And we'll chat more throughout the week, and then next week we'll have another snapshot conversation about this. Okay.
Yep.
All right. Thank you so much. Sorry for going over time.
Thanks, everyone.
So, thanks.